2 days, I think it was, before the war was launched in March 2003. The Washington Post had a great story, and the headline was something like, "Much of the Bush administration's case for war is inaccurate or wrong, experts say." And it was on page A19, it was, inside. And the question that I've had since that point is, under what definition of news is that not a front page story? That experts say administration's case for war is wrong.
All Governments Lie is a quote by a famous independent journalist named I.F. Stone. He published a weekly newsletter called I.F. Stone's Weekly, 4-page weekly that he published out of his house in Washington, D.C. The staff consisted of himself and his wife.
I believe very deeply in freedom of the press and the role of the press in a free society. And I have ever since I was a kid. You can't fulfill your function unless you're free.
One of the great reporters of the 20th century, I.F. Stone, told journalism students never to forget that all governments lie. He could speak with authority, having spent 7 decades exposing deception and official lies by digging deep into government documents and transcripts.
He is well known among journalists, especially independent journalists, investigative journalists. He's well known among those who work outside of the mainstream corporate news media.
I got to meet I.F. Stone in the mid-'80s in Washington, D.C. I wanted to put out my own weekly, Moore's Weekly, and I just wanted to go and talk to him about it. It was just an amazing afternoon that I got to have with him, to really kind of pick his brain and tell him, what I wanted to do, and he gave me, good advice I kind of already knew because I read him. His great motto of all governments are run by liars and nothing they say should be believed. And he said to me, but I would expand that now to governments, corporations. It's not just the government. It's that anybody in power. You must start as a journalist with the assumption that they are lying to you.
What we show is that through those various regimes in the United States, particularly, the mainstream corporate media were not holding the governments accountable the way they should, and in a very visual way show presidents like Richard Nixon and
Johnson.
Also other government officials, not just presidents. Colin Powell at the United Nations with his incorrect evidence that there were all these weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Gulf of Tonkin incident, of course, which drew the United States into the Vietnam War. It's serial lying over time. Seems to be what happens, especially people, and not just people in government, other people in power too.
And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think too that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
To share with you what the United States knows about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence.
What I want is somebody that can lay out some plans to trap these guys and whip hell out of them, kill some of them. That's what I want to do.
I'll try and bring something back that will meet that objective.
Give up.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas and the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
It was the independents like I.F. Stone who were revealing these lies when all the resources of the New York Times could have been put towards exposing this deception too, but they weren't doing it.
The film is inspired by I.F. Stone, but it's not really about I.F. Stone. It's about independent investigative journalists today, who are mostly, we filmed them during the US election campaign.
We're in New Hampshire, which is like the capital of depressed America, where the manufacturing economy has disappeared, and we really don't examine those issues at all. We don't actually talk to people at all, because you don't have time. There's only time to watch the speech, to ask the people in the audience what they think of the speech, and then you go on and you move on to the next spot. The entire thing could be shot in a soundstage in LA with just by rotating in a different audience each time.
I think we show in the film that the independent journalists today, the ones we profile in the film, are working in the way that I.F. Stone did, but they don't have the budgets to promote themselves the way the mainstream corporate conglomerate-owned media do.
Democracy Now! It's slightly larger, I think, than the space I.F. Stone operated out of, but very much modeled on this idea of the media being a sanctuary of dissent. Necessity is the mother of invention. We couldn't afford the satellites that the networks had. We worked with the internet from the beginning, out of necessity. Now we're broadcasting on over 1,300 radio and television stations, public access TV, community radio, PBS, public television, but we're not there to win a popularity contest. We're there to bring out the voices of people all over the world.
Well, both Democracy Now! And The Intercept have what I would call an adversarial approach to government, a skeptical approach to government statements, a desire to delve into the truth of what is really going on, and to feature investigative reports that sometimes take a lot of time.
Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill teamed up together at The Intercept. It was like a dream for adversarial journalists. And since 2014, they've been able, with their team, to break story after story of political corruption, especially scoop after scoop about the national security surveillance state, which mainstream journalists often tend to avoid out of a false notion of patriotism.
Good journalism today has the state in its crosshairs, and you never want to punch down. You always want to punch up. That's what I think we're trying to do at The Intercept.
But we also portray smaller operations, such as the one-man operation of TomDispatch.com. Tom Engelhardt.
Tom Engelhardt, with his blog, TomDispatch.com, is another example of how a journalist working from a small office at home can reach a very wide audience with independent reporting and analysis.
On how I started Tom Dispatch, you'd have to go back to literally to 9/11. And our news began to constrict, in a way I hadn't seen even at the height of the Cold War, as far as I was concerned. And I suddenly realized that out there was another kind of news.
With his website, TomDispatch.com, reaches people around the world with adversarial, investigative, independent journalism. And he's working out of a closet-sized office in his apartment.
Fred also went out to LA, and where there's the Young Turks, which is a fantastic online television show.
Okay. I.F. Stone was onto something really smart with this subscription business. What a lot of people miss about that business model, which in journalism is a smart business model, it puts your financial incentives in the right place. If your financial incentives are to please advertisers, you will please advertisers, right? But in the long run, you want to incentivize yourself to be aligned with your audience. The way you're aligned with your audience is if your audience is paying you.
John Carlos Frey is an example of the type of independent journalist who spends a lot of time, as financed, fortunately, by the Nation Institute, and has found the time that he needs that's required to do that sort of long-form investigative journalism. And Fred followed him to that work that he was doing along the Mexico-Texas border and digging up stuff that the New York Times and CBS and others just didn't have time for, didn't have the resources to put into that kind of digging.
We spent about a year doing this story, and we found evidence that bodies, human bodies, were buried in, I would say, a criminal way. If we had 200 bodies that were buried in a criminal way in the United States, if they were Anglo, I think that we'd be hearing about it. Because they're Mexican or because they're from south of the border, for the most part, there wasn't any sort of an uproar. The national media didn't pay attention. We found mass graves in the United States. We found people dumped into a mass grave. And they were not cataloged, they were not documented, they were not properly treated. Some individuals were buried in trash bags.
The mainstream media, if we're talking about national media coverage of the migrant deaths in Falfurrias, Texas, to my knowledge, has been non-existent.
We're not suggesting to people, that you shouldn't watch, CBS News or CNN, or you shouldn't read the New York Times, but you should have a balanced diet. They need to get some fiber in their diet, so to speak, and not just be consuming in some cases, pablum that the mainstream media are dishing out.
It's impossible to tell who was going to win the election, and not many people thought Donald Trump was going to win. He was certainly a major force in it. And as the president of CBS says in the film, it's great for business, it's great for CBS that Donald Trump is doing so well.
Who would have thought that this circus would come to town, but, it may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. That's all I got to say. The money's rolling in, and this is fun. I've never seen anything like this, and, this is going to be a very good year for us. It's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Go ahead. Keep going.
Now we have a president who is a liar. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It seems to happen in almost every tweet and every press conference. So it's even more important, more urgent that we have independent journalists, investigative journalists, who are speaking truth to power, who are calling those in power on the lies they are telling.
It is the case that if you go to most media figures and large media corporations and tell them that they're really constrained in the things they can and can't say, not only will they deny it, but they'll essentially be truthful in their denial, in the sense that they believe the denial because they don't have someone standing over their shoulder deleting words that they write or compelling them to say things they don't want to say. But the entire system breeds a certain orthodoxy. It breeds a certain kind of range of pieties, and if you deviate too far from them, it will reject you.